In the vibrant town of Ife, known for its rich history and deep ties to Yoruba spirituality, there was one place that the elders always warned the youth to avoid: the ancient graveyard at the outskirts of the village. It was said that the souls of the dead, particularly those of Oluwaseun, a legendary healer who was buried there, held immense power. No one truly understood the depth of the stories surrounding him, but the fear of disturbing his resting place was etched in the culture of Ife. But Kihind, a young man with more bravado than sense, had always scoffed at these stories. He was known for his reckless nature, constantly challenging tradition and defying the wisdom of the elders. Kihind's life was one of thrill and risk. Whether it was speeding through the narrow village roads on his motorcycle or mocking those who adhered to the old ways, Kihind thrived on the adrenaline that came from breaking rules. One evening, after a long day of work, Kihind and his friends sat around a fire near the village center, laughing and joking about the most recent gossip. The topic turned to the graveyard, and the stories of Oluwaseun's grave quickly became the subject of their conversation. Kihind, with his usual cocky smile, dared to say, "It's just a grave. What's the worst that could happen?" His friends, a mix of disbelief and excitement, dared him to prove his bravery by going to the graveyard and desecrating Oluwaseun's grave. "You wouldn't dare," Adebayo, one of his closest friends, challenged. Kihind looked around at the eager faces of his friends, who had gathered to witness his next great act. He could feel their expectations weighing on him. "I'll show you all how ridiculous these superstitions are," he said, laughing, as he stood up and walked toward the graveyard. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the quiet path leading to the cemetery. As Kihind entered the graveyard, the oppressive silence around him made his heart beat faster. He looked up at the tombstones, ancient and cracked, covered in moss and vines. At the center of the graveyard stood the infamous tomb of Oluwaseun. The stone was weathered, its inscriptions faded, but there was no mistaking it. This was the place of immense power. But Kihind wasn't afraid. Laughing at his own foolishness, Kihind unzipped his pants, facing the grave with an air of defiance. "Here's to you, Oluwaseun," he muttered under his breath, mocking the legends. As he urinated on the grave, his friends shouted in encouragement from the edge of the graveyard. But as the last drop fell, something happened. For a brief second, the wind stopped. The air grew thick and heavy, and Kihind felt a sudden chill in his bones. He paused mid-motion, sensing that something was terribly wrong. The ground beneath his feet trembled slightly, and his breath caught in his throat. The shadows around the grave seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, as if they were alive. "What the—" Kihind whispered, turning around quickly, but no one was there. His friends, who had been watching, had disappeared. In the distance, the faint whispers of his name could be heard. But they were not coming from his friends. They were deeper, darker, like the sound of the wind howling in a storm. Suddenly, the earth beneath the grave cracked open. The sound of splitting earth filled the air as a dark mist rose from the grave. Kihind staggered back, fear taking root in his heart. From the gaping hole, a figure slowly emerged, a figure unlike anything he had ever seen. It was a tall, shadowy form, dressed in ancient robes, its features distorted but unmistakably human. Kihind's legs trembled as the figure floated towards him, its eyes glowing with an intense, fiery light. The air grew colder, and the temperature dropped so sharply that Kihind could see his breath in the air. "You dare disrespect me?" the voice came, but it was not from a human mouth. The words vibrated through the air, as if coming from the very ground beneath his feet. "You, who mock the power of the dead, will pay the price for your arrogance." Kihind tried to move, to run, but his feet wouldn't budge. He felt as though the ground itself had claimed him. The figure raised a hand, and with one swift motion, Kihind was lifted off the ground. His body was paralyzed, his limbs stiff as if he were encased in ice. "You are cursed," the figure intoned, its voice colder than death itself. "Your soul is bound to this place. You will never know peace. The curse of Oluwaseun will follow you forever." Kihind tried to scream, but no sound came from his mouth. His mind raced as he was released and thrown back to the ground. He landed hard, pain shooting through his body, but when he opened his eyes, the figure was gone, and the grave was once again silent. Terrified and confused, Kihind scrambled to his feet, looking around. The graveyard was empty. His friends had vanished without a trace. He staggered out of the cemetery, his heart racing. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him. But no one seemed to notice. The following days were filled with a creeping dread. Kihind's friends ignored him, avoiding eye contact, and whispers followed him wherever he went. He felt a cold presence that never left him, even when he slept. Shadows followed him in the corners of his vision, and every sound seemed to have an eerie quality to it. That night, the nightmares began. He dreamt of the graveyard, of the figure emerging from the earth, and the voice that echoed in his head. It was relentless. He woke up in cold sweats, feeling as though the figure was still watching him. His life, once full of confidence and pride, began to unravel. People started treating him with fear, and his friends kept their distance. Desperate, Kihind visited local spiritual leaders, hoping for help. But every one of them refused to assist him, claiming that his fate had been sealed by the curse of Alyawazian. They spoke in hushed tones, warning him that no one could break the curse once it had been invoked. Weeks turned into months, and Kihind's life grew darker. He lost his job, his family became distant, and his health deteriorated. Every night, the figure from the graveyard visited him in his dreams, and the voice grew louder in his mind. "You cannot escape me, Kihind," it would say. "You will wander this earth as a living curse." Finally, Kihind returned to the graveyard one last time, seeking closure. But when he arrived, the grave was no longer there. Instead, there was only an empty patch of earth. The tombstone had vanished. Desperation overwhelmed him, and as he knelt down, tears streaming from his eyes, he realized that he was not just bound to the grave. The curse had consumed him entirely. Respect for the sacred, Kihind's disregard for the sacredness of the grave, specifically the grave of Alyawazian, led to severe consequences. The moral here is that disrespecting the sacred or the unknown can have unintended and irreversible consequences.